the room where it happened. NBC News has officially confirmed that President Trump was in the room when his former lawyer and fixer Michael Cohen and National Enquirer publisher and old friend of President Trump, David Pecker, discussed how to counter stories about then-candidate's relationship with different women. The details came out of the non-prosecution agreement David Pecker's company, American Media Inc., signed with the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Manhattan. The president's involvement was first reported by the Wall Street Journal, of all places.
All right, in the agreement, AMI, American Media Incorporated, admitted to, quote, making a payment in the amount of $150,000 in cooperation, consultation, and concert with a candidate's 2016 presidential campaign. That, of course, is Donald Trump. And this morning, Michael Cohen gave an interview on ABC, signaling to the president and investigators that he is still willing to talk despite his 3-year prison sentence.
If they want me, I'm here, and I'm willing to answer whatever additional questions that they may have for me. And I will spend the rest of my life in order to fix the mistake that I made.
Joining us now, former federal prosecutor Elliot Williams and NBC News investigations reporter Tom Winter. Okay, Tom, put this reporting in context for us. I didn't hear any Russian names there, okay? And one might say, is this thing going rogue? I thought this was all about Russia and Russian involvement. So for people who aren't following this page by page, minute by minute, what in the world's going on here?
It's a great question. So what we have here is we have Robert Mueller, essentially when he took over the investigation, if you will, into the Trump campaign, into Russia, this question of Russia interference in the election. Basically, he said, give me all your cases. New York, give me all your cases. D.C., give me all your cases. Eastern District of Virginia, give me all your cases. We're going to bring everything under one big tent. Mm-hmm. And then from there, if it's not germane to the mission, in other words, if it's not specific to Russian interference in the 2016 election and whether or not it was coordinated with the Trump campaign, then it goes back to the appropriate district or the jurisdiction where it should be investigated. So yes, the Michael Cohen matter, the AMI, the David Pecker, this meeting in 2015, Trump being in the room, to your point, there's not a single Russian name in there that we're aware of. It has nothing to do with Russia, but it is a federal crime. That's what's been charged here. That's what people have pleaded guilty to. That's what a non-prosecution agreement involves. So it went to the right place. It was not in Robert Mueller's purview, so it went to the Southern District of New York. They were involved in the Manafort investigation. Some aspects of that were something that office took a look into. So, you know, they have the jurisdiction to look into these issues, and that's why you're seeing this being prosecuted in New York. The interesting question is here, how many other investigations and what else is going on that has nothing to do with Russia that does involve people in this White House? That's a big question. So
to the extent that, Elliot, there isn't a necessary Russian connection here, it's huge. Donald Trump, who has continued to deny, deflect, suggest that he had nothing to do with it. The idea that he was in a room where an idea was discussed, possibly concocted, about payments to people to keep something quiet for his own benefit in an election, and again, I'm paraphrasing here because I don't know exactly what was talked about, that's a really big deal. However, the defense from Donald Trump to everything seems to be the same, right? It's some version of, I didn't understand, wasn't listening, it was his fault, that guy should have known better.
Okay, well, it would not, the very timing of this meeting and the very timing of attempting to sort of hide these affairs makes it abundantly clear that this was intended to sway the election. Now remember, at least the McDougal affair was I think a decade before Election Day 2016, and I'm pretty certain that the allegations of the Stormy Daniels affair were back then as well. They were a long time before. Yet magically, and this is in the clip you played of Michael Cohen at the beginning of this, magically these meetings started happening in the immediate run up to Election Day. So the notion that, number one, there wasn't an attempt and intent by the campaign by the Trump organization to try to suppress this information is preposterous, and it defies logic and defies reason.
Okay.
Now, sure.
But, no, sorry, finish, please.
I was going to say, bigger picture, it's like King Midas was everything he touched turned to gold. Everything Donald Trump touches, every organization, turns to federal offenses. If you now look, there's reporting this morning that the Trump Inaugural Committee is being investigated. You have the Inaugural Committee, the Trump Organization, the Trump Foundation, the Trump Campaign, and now the Trump White House, all having individuals who have either pled guilty or are under investigation or, or subject to, future investigation and so on. And at a certain point, point. Yes, Allie, like you said, the president can punt it off and say, I didn't know, it's the deep state, everybody's out to get me. But when you've got 20 investigations going on at the same time, it's abundantly clear that there's a web of illegality and the president's at the center of it.
Okay, but explain then what the implications of this is huge are. And I say that because yes, we've learned all of this, but a lot of our outrage and that he lied and he did this and he did that, a lot of those things people knew about when it came to President Trump and his character and Trump as a business person before. So when we say the web of illegality is massive, this is huge, what are the consequences? Because thus far, he hasn't had to suffer any.
Right. Typically, the consequences of federal offenses are harm to your reputation and jail time, and it seems like the president of the United States is, will be immune to at least one of those. The president, frankly, should have taken heat for not releasing his tax returns years ago. The president should have taken heat for those comments, the Access Hollywood comments that we heard about, or going after federal judges. Nothing seems to stick to the president of the United States, even these serious allegations. Now, the difference is the courts don't care what the public thinks or what Republican primary voters think. Ultimately, if the president can be brought to court and the facts and the law support a conviction, then yes, he will pay for it. But the reputational cost seems that nothing sticks to the president. Right. We've talked about that before.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.